A man near the back shook his head. This doesn't make any sense. He never spoke about another woman. His wife. He hesitated, glancing at the grieving widow, who sat frozen, her hands gripping the edges of her dress. The elderly woman's gaze softened as she turned to the widow. He never told you, did he? Her voice carried a deep sadness. There was a time, long before you, when he made promises, ones he never kept. The widow's lip trembled, but she didn't speak. The daughter swallowed hard, looking between the woman and her mother. Someone finally asked the question lingering in everyone's mind. Why now? Why tell us this today? The elderly woman's eyes darkened. Because the truth doesn't die just because someone does. A hushed murmur filled the space. Everyone knew they were moments away from hearing something that would change everything. A heavy silence stretched through the room, thick with unspoken questions. The elderly woman held their gazes, her expression unreadable, as if debating how much more to reveal. But then she took a slow breath and spoke again. "There's something else," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "Something he kept from all of you, but especially from his family." The widow stiffened. The daughter's hands curled into fists. The air felt charged, as if the truth was clawing its way to the surface. The elderly woman hesitated for just a moment before continuing. "I wasn't just someone from his past," she admitted. "I wasn't just a secret. I was." She paused, her voice catching. Then she looked directly at the daughter. "I was supposed to be asterisk, his wife asterisk." Gasps filled the room. The daughter's face paled. That can't be true," she stammered. The elderly woman's eyes glistened with old, buried pain. "He loved me. We were engaged. But one day, without warning, he left. No explanation. No goodbye. He disappeared and built a new life." The widow's breath hitched. Her hands trembled, but she didn't say a word. The daughter looked at her, searching for some kind of reassurance, but there was none. A man near the back scoffed. "You expect us to believe that." His voice was laced with doubt, but there was fear in his eyes too, the fear that she might be telling the truth. The elderly woman's lips pressed together, then she reached into her bag. Slowly, she pulled out something small, something old. She held it up for everyone to see, a faded photograph of a young man, smiling with his arm wrapped tightly around a woman. Asterisk or asterisk. The room erupted in whispers. Some guests stood, straining to get a better look. The resemblance was unmistakable. The man in the photograph was him. The widow's voice finally broke through the noise. "Why are you telling us this asterisk now asterisk?" The elderly woman's eyes darkened. "Because I wasn't the only one he left behind." The daughter's breath caught. "What do you mean?" The elderly woman's next words sent a chill through the room. "He had another child, and they're here today." The room froze. Every whispered conversation, every skeptical glance, every quiet breath came to a halt. The daughter's face twisted in disbelief. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible." The elderly woman's gaze remained steady. "It is," she said softly. "And they're here, right now." The guests turned, scanning the crowd, searching for the hidden truth among them. Some looked at one another, wondering if it could be someone they knew. The tension was unbearable. Then from the back of the room, a figure slowly stepped forward. A man, young, but with familiar features. The same strong jawline. The same sharp eyes. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd as people recognized it. He asterisk looked asterisk like the deceased. The daughter's breath came out in short, shaky bursts. Who are you?" she managed to ask. The young man hesitated, then met her eyes. "I'm his son," he said simply. Her heart ached as she faced a reality that grew harder to ignore. The courtroom was no longer enough. She couldn't simply rule on his case as she would any other. Elijah had already captured a piece of her heart, and there was no going back now. But what would happen when the system, the law, and her own sense of duty collided with her growing desire to give him what he needed most? The clock was ticking, and the tension had reached a boiling point. Just when Judge Williams thought she was coming to terms with her emotions, another unexpected twist sent everything spiraling. A call came early one morning from the foster care agency. Elijah's case had been reassigned to another judge. The news hit her like a punch to the gut. They were transferring him to a different courtroom, and she wouldn't have the chance to continue overseeing his future. The reason? Allegations of partiality. Her connection to Elijah had raised questions about her ability to remain impartial. Suddenly, everything she had hoped for seemed even more out of reach. The very thing that had made her fight for Elijah's future, the bond they shared, was now the barrier keeping her from being the one to make a difference in his life. As the legal system began to move forward, Elijah was once again facing an uncertain future. The new judge, a strict and detached figure, didn't seem to understand the depth of what had transpired between Elijah and Judge Williams. Their connection was dismissed as sentimental, and the worst part, Elijah's case was being fast-tracked for adoption by a family that wasn't ready to love him the way he deserved. The thought of Elijah being placed in yet another home with strangers who might never understand him tormented Judge Williams. What was worse, following the law and letting him go, or defying the very system that had been her career for years? Each option felt like a betrayal, but she knew there was no going back now. She had already crossed a line, and the stakes had never been higher. Would she be willing to risk everything to fight for a child who was already slipping away? The tension was suffocating, and the decision loomed over her with unbearable weight. The day of Elijah's final hearing arrived, and the weight on Judge Williams' shoulders was unbearable. As she walked into the courtroom, she saw him sitting there, looking smaller than ever, his eyes filled with uncertainty. The adoption papers were in front of her, ready for a signature that would forever change his life. Everything in her mind screamed to step back, to follow the rules, to let him go. But her heart had already made its choice. With trembling hands, she began to speak. "I cannot, in good conscience, approve this adoption." The words were out before she could second-guess them. The room fell silent, everyone looking at her as though she had justified the very fabric of the system. She knew this would cost her. She knew the consequences of her actions could be severe, but in that moment, none of that mattered. "I believe this child deserves more than just a foster home or a temporary placement. He deserves a chance to belong, to know what it means to be loved unconditionally." She paused, her voice breaking. "And I want to give him that." The room erupted into murmurs, and for a long moment, no one knew what would happen next. The other judge, the social workers, the legal team, all were stunned by the decision. But it was Elijah who broke the silence. He looked up at Judge Williams, his eyes wide, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. Not just any smile, but one that radiated pure hope. Then, as if fate had decided it wasn't done testing them yet, a lawyer from the adoption agency stood up, holding a thick envelope. He'd been quiet throughout the hearing, but now his voice was sharp, serious. "Your Honor, there's something you need to know. We've just received new information. The adoption paperwork you've been presented with has an error. It's not for Elijah. It was meant for another child." A part of her wanted to fade into the background, to just walk out of the store and pretend it never happened. But the tension was too thick. She could feel the eyes of everyone around her, their stares not just on her, but on what this moment symbolized. Would the woman back down? Would the manager take control? The situation was rapidly escalating, and no one knew how it would end. Then, as the silence stretched on, the woman's eyes narrowed. "I didn't come here to argue with you," she said, her voice low, almost daring him to say something more. The subtle challenge hung in the air. Would her pride let her admit fault, or would she push back, escalating this moment even further? The answer seemed to hover just on the edge of what was about to unfold. The tension in the air grew heavier as the woman's challenge hung between them. Her eyes, defiant now, seemed to dare the CEO to escalate this further. But just as it felt like the situation was about to explode, something unexpected happened.